Welcome to the IVM Podcast Network.
You're listening to Keeping It Queer with Navin Narona.
Hello everyone, welcome to an all-new episode of Keeping It Queer. Today in the studio with me, I have two very special guests. Hello guys.
Hi.
Hey.
We have Alok Vaid-Menon, everybody, in the studio. Alok is a non-binary, trans-feminine writer, entertainer and performance artist based in New York. They are well known for their powerful spoken word performances that tackle issues surrounding gender, non-conformity and homophobia. We also have Shaktii. Hi Shaktii. Shaktii is also a gender non-conforming trans individual who is an activist for RAGE, a feminist organization that takes a look at how oppressed the women are in the country and in the world. So welcome both of you to Keeping It Queer.
We're glad to be here.
Yes, so this is your first time in India, or how is it?
It's our first time traveling in India together, but we've been here individually on our own before. Both of us have family in India.
So both of you all grew up, I'm assuming, in America. So let's go back all the way to your early lives. We'll take Alok's life first and we'll go to Shakti's.
Sure.
All right, so Alok, how was it for you growing up?
Sure. I grew up in Texas, which would confirm every stereotype you've ever had about Texas, meaning that I literally lived with cowboys who rode horses and said y'all every 2 words. So it's a deeply conservative, homophobic, transphobic, very religious space. So for me, I think it was a very difficult place to exist as a trans person, as an Indian person, as someone who wasn't Christian. And I dealt with a lot of bullying and harassment growing up. And I think what's unique about being a gay or a trans person is that your own family can't support you through that. I think that's different in the U.S. when you're experiencing racism. At least you have the support of your family to talk about that.
That's true.
But when you're gay or you're trans, you have to be silent about the experiences of violence you have. So then the issue of mental health comes up because you have no one to actually process all of the harassment that you're going through. And so I think growing up I was very sad and I didn't really have a space to talk about it. And I think that inspires a lot of the work that I do today, because I'm sort of trying to create a world where young people actually have artists who are engaging with the things that they're going through.
So at what age did you find out that you want to talk about it and let your family know or your friends know?
Sure. So I think we all resonate with this experience of our families and the media don't really teach us that we exist. So from a young age, I knew that I was different. I just didn't really have the language to explain what I was. I eventually stumbled on the word gay. I thought that worked. It didn't really. So I came out multiple times, and I think that's the experience for a lot of us as trans people, is because we don't actually know that it's possible to be trans. We just use different words. So I first came out as gay when I was 17 to my family, and for me the idea was I wanted to come out as soon as I was graduating from high school, because then I could leave Texas. And so for me, I don't really identify as being closeted. It was more about being strategic, because I knew that if I had come out when I was living there, I would experience a lot of harassment and violence. So I wanted to make sure that I actually could get out and be in a place where I'd be safe. So it's not that I was repressed. I think it was that I had agency, because I think often we expect LGBT people just to be victims and not to be actively fighting and combating.
That's true.
And for me, I was just thinking, okay, I know that this is what I am. I just can't do that here. And then eventually, when I got to college, I began to learn more, meet other LGBT people for the first time, because I really didn't know any at all growing up. And then I learned more terms, and I learned a term called trans, or transgender. And at first I thought, okay, I don't feel like a woman, so I can't be transgender. But then when I started to learn more, that transgender actually means that you identify as a gender that's different than what you were assigned at birth. So that means you don't have to necessarily identify as a woman, you just have to identify as something different. And so I started to realize, oh wait, I don't actually identify as a man or a woman. And once I realized that I didn't have to be either, I think I finally found something that really fit for me.
That's amazing. All right, let's go to Shaktii. Shaktii, how was growing up for you?
Cool. So I'm born and raised in New York City, and I grew up in Queens, which is, I think, still considered one of the most diverse places in the world per capita. I grew up right alongside migrant Latin American and South Asian communities, which I think was really formative for me. That, yes, like you do experience racism there, but I was always held by this tight-knit migrant community in Queens. I think in some ways, growing up and being queer in New York City is definitely a lot different than it is in the South, you know. Just growing up in like a metropolitan urban center, like
it's more free in that regard, right? Like in New York, it's much different than, as one might say in Texas, the freedom to be yourself is a little better.
Yeah, but I also want to challenge like what it means to be like free, or like when people imagine being free and like in a metropolitan area in like the West, you know, is you do have important things like a lot more access to you know, like healthcare, like you can have a drop-in center, you know, and get tested, things that you might not find, or gender-affirming health providers that you might not find in the South, where they're just like a train ride away. You have like a lot of nearby social centers and clubs and places where queer people can meet and congregate, but also this idea of like, you know, like freedom and visibility, like some people are punished for it, you know. And in New York City, like you can definitely be visible on the street, and I definitely grew up seeing other queer and trans people, but I also saw them being punished for being queer and trans, you know.
So we've all heard about the death rates that happen, and people are murdered left, right, and center. And I feel that it's high time in a country which is apparently so forward, that people wouldn't have to be afraid of living the way they live. So how do you feel in an environment like that?
I think an environment like that is really unique and challenging, you know? And when I say I grow up seeing like queer and trans people punished, I mean, I didn't just see queer and trans people being harassed in the street. Like I saw trans women like in poverty, you know, like on Jackson Heights on Roosevelt Avenue.
True.
I saw a lot of trans women, trans feminine sex workers being like arrested or pushed up against police cars, or just being assaulted on the floor in handcuffs, you know. And
even then, trans women of color are more harassed as compared to the other.
Yeah, of course. All the immigrants, some of them non-English speaking, trans sex workers and other people in underground economies in Queens are definitely disproportionately targeted, you know, unlike what many organizations or political discourse in the U.S. would like you to believe.
And this is something we see in India as well. There's a very stark familiarity when it comes to where the eunuchs or the Hijra community from India is belittled to the point of begging and sex work, when they could do so much more. Like, you know, we don't even identify them as a proper gender because we don't give them the rights of education or proper hygiene or health services. And I don't know from where the stigma comes in general, because gender is such a delicate topic to tackle for anybody. So how do you feel about it, Alok? Like, you are someone who's non-conforming, you don't identify as a man or a woman. So how, from that perspective, would you educate a person who does not know about it?
Sure. I think in the Indian context, it makes me very sad because we actually have a very long cultural, political, social, religious history of people who were outside of the gender binary. And in fact, the gender binary is a very Western idea that wasn't actually indigenous to so many of the cultures here. So for me, I understand a lot of the violence and policing of trans people, especially Hijras, especially working class people, and as trans people in the Indian diaspora, as having to do with people not actually knowing their history. And I think part of what happened with colonization in South Asia is that we lost our history, right? I think what's interesting is that, you know, after independence, we didn't actually talk about creating archives about what actually happened to us. So I think what happens for many of us as LGBT people is we're told that we're new, that we're indoctrinated from the West, that we've been contaminated, but we know at a very deep level that there have always been people like us here, but we often don't have access to those records because they were forcibly erased. So for me, I think that's why I get very sad in an Indian context, because I'm like, homophobia and transphobia makes no sense here.
Yeah, because like, even if you look at our myths and our literature, we have had very strong, prominent characters who have been not only non-gender conforming, as well as experimenting with their gender and sexuality.
Right. But not even just culture. I mean, I think even when I'm in India, I get hit on more than anywhere else in the world.
You'd be glad.
Right. There's just a much more fluid conception of sexuality here.
That's true.
It's not as much about I'm straight, I'm gay. It's much more complicated than that. And I feel like we're losing a lot of that as we just emphasize that we live in a binary world. I think, you know, so much of what informs mine and Shaktii politics is we're fighting for a place where not just gay people, but everyone is able to say, this is who I am, and that you don't have to have a label or a word. It's just about who you are.
But we do get binary, and we just have to eventually come down to a label or a tag. And how do you feel about that? Like, you don't want to have that kind of tag sometimes. You just want to be who you are, but you don't have the words to define who do you want to explain yourself as. So where does that come in?
I think it's such a mindfuck, because something that me and Alok talk about often is that we actually don't believe that anyone is really cis,
Can you explain what cisgender is?
Oh, right. So cisgender is you identify with the gender that you were assigned at birth, right? Coercively assigned at birth. So,
when doctor slapped your butt inappropriately and told you.
Exactly.
Right, and the doctor was like, it's a boy, and if you are still a boy, then you're cis, Or it's a girl, and if you still identify as a girl, you're cis. To put it simply. So we oftentimes talk about how actually there's no one that's cis, right? And there's this ludicrous idea, right, that we can construct an idea and just tell an infant that you're this, and it's going to inform how they act, how they engage with the world for the rest of their lives. And actually, gender itself is a performance. We know that in the Indian context and the American context, it's so bizarre that the binary is something that, that everyone has in common. It doesn't do justice to our legacies. And I think that's what also is really hard for me to answer when people are like, oh, when did you know you were trans, or when did you know you were queer, It's actually like, when did you know you were cis,
Yeah.
Because that was something that was definitely taught. And I think I want to add on in the Indian context, as Alok was talking about, that it was really interesting growing up in Queens and a part of a Sikh community. We would go to the Ravadasya temple, and they would have all these scriptures and teachings about like abolishing caste and abolishing gender, and then you would like walk outside of that, and you still had this binary imposed on you, I was still taught a certain Savarna masculinity that I had to emulate.
Because in the Sikh community, it's a very essential thing to respect your masculinity, the beard, the hair. It's all like a subset of the years of brainwashing that we have been a part of. But in comparison, I think Sikh community is also someone who's they're very inclusive in that context. They won't just shun you out, but they'll also be nice to you. Is that what happened to you? Were you
right? And then I also think there's this like narrative, that we face in America where like our people are just are considered like backwards or desexualized, and then like we actually come here and realize that our people have a lot more progressive ideas around gender and sexuality than what we've been told, that our people are actually like really erotic, more than anything we see in public in the US.
Because of the whole reason that in India it's not about they are okay with people existing with their own labels, they're okay with gay people, they're okay with lesbians, they do want to laugh at your back when you turn around, but they also are okay with the existence. Their main problem comes with the sex. The whole Supreme Court verdict as well. It all boiled down to the act of sexual intercourse, and that was not the whole movement about. The whole idea was to let people be. So when you say that, when people don't really hide their erotica, it's because we have been suppressed so much. Now it's like there's no other outlet. There's just fuck, guys. that's what it's come to. So so now let's move on to. Alok, I wanted to ask you about you coming out to your family, and how was your family's reaction, and what was what convinced you to move out?
Right. I think that for me, there's a difference between acceptance and tolerance. And I think a lot of what we do as LGBTI, and I meaning intersex, people is that we accept tolerance and we don't push for acceptance. And when I say tolerance, what I mean is, okay, yeah, I get it, but you don't really ask questions about our love life. You don't actually ask questions about our health. You don't ask questions about, you don't want to learn more. And so I think what happened with me is that when I first decided to come out, I knew that my parents would tolerate me, but I was concerned that they wouldn't fully accept me. And I think that's been a negotiation for the past few years, is really trying to say what it looks like to accept me is to understand that my politics are part of my identity, right? Because I think that what happens is that often people will accept LGBT people if we shut up. If we're just LGBT in private, if we're just LGBT, with our LGBT community, but then if we actually bring those ideas into the forefront, then we're told to keep quiet. And so I think what I struggle most with my family is around my activism around these issues. I think that they're okay that I am trans now, but I think they struggle with how publicly trans I am. But I think for me, I think a lot about how it's actually really necessary to push the envelope, because so many people still don't really have examples of what it looks like to be trans in the public imagination. And trans people are so often privatized. What I mean by that is, it's not that we're not desired, it's that people desire us in private. It's not that we're not there, it's just that we're pushed into the margins of society. So what I try to tell my family is, accepting me as a trans person is also accepting my community. You have to understand that many of us don't have family support. Many of us don't have any economic mobility. Many of us don't actually have safety. And so until all of these people are able to be as privileged as I am, I'm not going to keep quiet.
Precisely, like they say, don't be gay in public, just be gay in your own world. But we don't. We'll keep on continuing and we keep on shouting about it. We'll find out what you did after the small break, and we'll talk about your activism.
Sure.
Did you know that some termites in Africa have a pleasantly minty flavor?
Did you know that India's largest music festival was in a way conceptualized in Estonia?
Did you know that the awesomest chips in the world are found only inside US prisons?
Hello, I'm Chuck.
I'm Srikit.
And I'm Navin.
And together we are
Simplified,
a podcast that helps you appear smarter to an audience that knows no different.
Or give you some stuff to talk about at parties.
We are ultra crepidarians.
And if you don't know what that means,
Then tune into Simplified with a B on iTunes, Audio Boom, or your favorite podcasting app. Episodes out every fortnight.
Alright, back again on Keeping It Queer. We have Alok and Shaktii with me in the studio. So Alok, you were saying that how you had the whole struggle of telling your family and helping them understand. But how did you move out, and what was the whole deal?
Right. I think the thing with Indians is that we end up staying with our families forever. So that moment of saying, I'm out, is like a huge deal. But for me, I knew that I couldn't actually explore myself if I was still at home. I knew that because often in an Indian family dynamic, my parents would constantly police what I was wearing, what I was doing, where I was going, what I was saying. And I knew that I had to explore for myself, meet other people for myself. And I often say, my family was not as supportive as my friends. I think LGBT friendships are so necessary because I finally met people who helped me grow up as a queer person.
And they're stronger as well. The relationships run deeper. They understand the very core of the idea.
Much deeper. So for me, I moved to California for college after. And I went to California because I knew the history of the LGBT movement in San Francisco and the Bay Area. And I knew that I wanted to be an activist. Because, I don't know, I guess I just grew up knowing that the oppression I was experiencing was not... It could be challenged. It was not permanent. It just required us to actually struggle against it. So for me, I understood coming out as part of my bigger journey of becoming a political activist. And so I moved to California and I started to work with the LGBT community. And I think that is where I really got politicized, especially around transgender issues. Because even within the LGBT community, there's a lot of struggle. So what ends up happening is that the interests of predominantly elite gay men get prioritized, and then all the rest of us are just seen as too complicated, too messy, too much. And so I really started to become very politicized about transgender issues, and now I've been working as a trans activist.
Because there's a very weird undercurrent of sexism even there. Like,
Right.
you know, like eventually it becomes all about the gay men,
Right.
not about the other non-conforming people.
Right.
So Shaktii works a lot with the feminists rather, with the organization Rage. So how did that come about? How did you convince yourself that you have to fight for this cause?
Where I think a lot actually has to do with my parents. I think people create this narrative that that like we're exceptional as like queer, trans, and gender non-conforming people, and not realizing how intimately tied our freedom and our liberation is to home and the communities that we came from, regardless of how they identified. So what politicized me, besides having incredible artists and mentors in my lives, was actually my mother, and my sibling. People where I realized that, that I wouldn't find any sort of like freedom or solace or liberation in my sexuality or gender if my mother didn't have the same thing. That the same system that doesn't allow me to be actually in many ways pushes aside my mother's history, erases her sexuality, erases her desire. And so that's what really galvanized me. And then meeting several folks who were organizing, yes, around issues that were specifically around queer, trans, and gender non-conforming people's access to healthcare, housing, their protection from police brutality, and that all of these struggles are actually really, really connected, you know. I think there's this language that we struggle in this moment that we're in the U.S., where people just want trans visibility, you know, and that actually doesn't translate to trans liberation. I think for people to wake me up about that and to teach that and to take what I've witnessed growing up is what really politicized and radicalized me to do the work that I do now.
And I'm glad you spoke about the current situation in the Americas. It's because you have a very homophobic vice president, and I can't even imagine being there at this point, because the whole war seems lost after years and years of trying to come out and get equal licenses to marry and exist. Now we have the situation, and believe it or not, every country looks up to America at some point as a superpower or as a country that's evolved. But now we have this weird situation where you have Trump and Pence in the White House. So how do you feel about it as residents of America and as Indians who have obviously roots on both sides? So how do you feel about that?
Deeply concerned, but totally expecting this. And this is why I tell everyone that activism is more important than policy, because policy can shift overnight. Whereas activism, if you actually build a movement about it, that doesn't go away, and those movement relationships continue. And so what I think that the case of the LGBT movement in the U.S. can teach the rest of the world is we were very policy saturated, and we relied on courts, and we relied on politicians, and we didn't rely on actually building a movement. And so now what I worry is that there's going to be an increase in anti-gay and anti-trans violence, but we're not actually going to have the infrastructure to support it, because we don't actually have organizations that are working with survivors of homophobic and transphobic hate crimes. We don't actually have organizations that are actually trying to go out into the community and actually keep people safe. And so what I'm worried about more than anything is not that there's not only going to be an escalation in violence, but that there's going to be no support for those people. I mean, after Trump was elected, I heard of trans women getting their cars burned in Tennessee. I heard of trans women getting hanged in Tennessee. I heard of a lot of gay men getting bashed, getting harassed. I was just walking around the street in New York. I get harassed a lot, but this man this one time said, "I'm going to grab you by the pussy," which you might not know is something that Trump said during the election. So
they have T-shirts and hats now
right,
being sold with that slogan.
Absolutely. So
what a time to be alive.
Yeah.
Right.
So you're seeing a lot of men be emboldened by Trump being elected to be the misogynists that they already were.
So it's now a manifestation of their homophobia and their hate towards anything that's not them. So it's come to that. And when you look at all this violence, and I don't think any organization, because we have organizations in India to safeguard the rights of certain people, but when it comes to downright violence, you can't stop that, because unless you're a famous gay person who's living in a high-rise building with proper security, you're safe. But they can now come into your house,
right,
and they can kill you. If you see before Vendetta, there's a scene where a lesbian couple is broken up and they're beaten, and that seems like a reality now. It was uncanny at that point, but now it's true. And how do we go ahead from this? Basically, that's the question, right? How do we regroup and how do we fight this? Because we have a regressive system in place now all over the world. And how do we tell the next generation that, it's going to get better, because it hasn't gotten better for us? So how do we fight that?
I think first we need to be real, that it doesn't get better. It actually has gotten worse, and that what's happening right now isn't exceptional, but was very calculated. Yes, Trump winning the election in America, also Brexit happening, also a couple of years ago Modi and the BJP coming to power,
Mm-hmm.
And I think part of countering violence is we actually just need to pool our resources and change our priorities. We need to acknowledge that transphobic and homophobic people in power, the right wing, actually organizes a lot better than us. Their activism is a lot stronger than us.
Because it's driven by hate. So when you actually put all the hate together and point it somewhere, it actually gains a result. And do you think that's on our part as well, that we are not as angry as we should be? We are more laid back. We are all about our lives at this point, and we are like, okay, let's make love, have parties, and then think about fighting. Is that what happens in general?
I think we do need to be angry, but I also think we need to prioritize what we're angry about, So, for example, like Alok touched on, this fight for marriage equality, you had these massive LGBTQ NGOs in America that actually put millions and millions of dollars into fighting against Prop 8, and like individual pieces of legislation, right? And what would it look like if we actually took all that rage and all that money and devoted to a cause like bailing out current trans people who are incarcerated. You know, what would it look like if we took that money and we were shutting down detention centers with it? You know, what if we gave that money not to just people's salaries, but actually to activists who are organizing on the ground and fighting for the safety
but as you
of
said,
their
Prop
communities.
8 was just like another tool that came after Prop 6, which was years ago.
Right.
So every certain decades, they'll just keep revamping their policies and try to hit us back. And eventually, like, what if an organization runs out of money trying to fight these evil people?
They have run out of money. I think another thing that the LGBT movement in the U.S. can teach is that after marriage equality was accessed, 60% of the donors of the LGBT movement in the U.S. stopped giving because they said the movement was over. So now a lot of them are like, oh crap, like what? So many gay organizations shut down, and now there's not as strong of an LGBT movement infrastructure, because what you saw was that after marriage equality, people started to fund the international movement. So a lot of money was going to places like India, and then now a lot of people are like, oh, we didn't actually figure it out here. And that's why a lot of us as trans activists are just screaming, I told you so.
Yeah, because getting equality in marriage is not the only end game. There's a bigger... Because eventually we have to talk to people. We have to educate them.
Right.
And given the societal structure we live in, you know how difficult it is, right? For a man to understand that another male person can also be feminine, or for that matter, be more sexually fluid. But how do we convince others? Because Alok, you use poetry as a form of activism. So how did you get started with that?
Sure. So I was talking earlier about how growing up in Texas, I had no one to speak to about the experiences of violence I was going through, but I kept a very vibrant journal and diary. And that's where I started writing poetry, is I would just sit alone in my room and write about my feelings. And at the time, I didn't really understand this was about sexuality, this was about gender, it was just about this hurts. And so I started to post my diaries online, and then people were like, wow, you're a poet. And I never saw myself as a poet because I thought poetry was just like Shakespeare. And I thought what I was doing was just like emo, like teenage writing. And so then people were like, keep on writing. So I started to see myself more as a written poet. And then for the first time I saw performance poetry, and what I loved about it was that it was people talking about things that I never thought you could talk about on a stage, and being able to get away with it, and not only being able to get away with it, with having people cheer for it. And I started to realize, there's a long history, especially in the cultures that I'm from, of the stage being used as a place to be honest about what's happening in the world. And I think things like stand-up comedy, spoken word poetry, drag are so necessary because they bring people together and can have honest town hall conversations. So I started to see myself as a poet, and now for the past decade I've been performing poetry. And the reason I continue to turn to poetry as a medium is that I think what the right wing is so good at doing is dehumanizing LGBTI people. They reduce us to stereotypes. They reduce us to
deviants who just want to fuck. That's all.
Wrong narratives. And we need more narratives, and we don't just need one narrative. And I think what the good thing about poetry and performances is my story is not every story of transgender people, but you're able to say, I know Alok as a person, and then what I hope is that you can begin to meet other trans people as people, and recognize that we're just as complex as straight people and as cisgender people.
That's admirable, because I caught you performing this week, and I was blown away by because performance poetry is something that we don't really get to see so much, because people talk and they just talk and that's it. Like, eventually don't get to see the drive behind it. And with your performance, I really saw something very unique. And so did you take some time to find your own voice with regard to that, or how was it working with other people who are also talking about certain issues?
I believe that we're all artists. I think that those of us who identify our artists are people who have had people tell us that we were artists. And so for me, I think that we all have a creative drive, and I think that our schools often fail us because they only nurture the sort of logical part of our brain. So we're taught math, we're taught science, but we're not taught art in a very serious way. So for me, all the artistic education I got was by learning from other artist friends, just going to as many performances as possible, watching people on an open mic, seeing the sort of strategies that they took, and then I got to develop my own style, and it takes practice. I think a lot of people think art is just like silly and you don't put that much time in it, but I think every stage performer knows that even for 3 minutes of content, you're preparing hours of preparation.
Took me 2 years to write 10 minutes of jokes.
Right.
So Shaktii, did you meet Alok at the same time when they were in New York?
Yeah, I actually did meet Alok in New York at one of their performances. And I think originally we did connect and were did like build a relationship based on this, commonality of actually just being like queer and trans South Asians, in a really big city and in a world that was also out to erase us. But since then, have shared like common beliefs and common struggles around like a multitude of things, around our relationships, around our intimacies, around what we create and what we do.
So, and that's important to have, to always have a good friend, a backup support to go through the same nonsense that you go through. All right, so before we wind up the podcast, we'll have a small performance piece by Alok, because I want the listeners to hear the words and the powerful thoughts that you have in your performance poetry. So can we hear something?
Sure. So this is a poem about my father. I say it a lot in the Indian context because I feel like we all resonate with this idea that our fathers are way more complex than they tell us, that often they are not publicly emotional, often they repress a lot of their histories. And so poetry was a place that I actually began to write about my father and then share the poems with him, and it prompted all these amazing conversations where I found out about all of his past relationships, all of his past desires, and I think it made me forgive him in a different way and understand where his homophobia and transphobia came from. When I'm 11 years old, my father tells me that the parking lot smells a lot like marijuana. To say that I am scandalized would be an understatement. You see, I was a prude love child of the middle school DARE program, which means that I was taught that the minute you consume drugs, you become a very, very bad man. So when my father insinuates that he knows the smell, I judge him to be an evil man and tell him to confess immediately, or I am running away from home. He laughs and says, "The things you will never know about my past." I have never asked my father who he dated before my mother. I have never asked him about his first kiss. I do not know what he hoped his life would look like or whether or not that came true. You see, there's this thing that happens when you call someone a father. He ceases to become a person and instead becomes a punchline for everything that you hate about yourself. He becomes a parable, a story that begins with your birth, as if on that day 2 new people are born. Everything he is before this moment is now history, his story. There's this thing that happens when you are trans, when you know you are not a man because you know you are not your father's son, and the moment you tell him this, he becomes everything you are running away from. So in this way, being trans is another way of announcing, I am running away from home. I've never asked my father what it felt like to become history, to watch 30 years of memory coil inside of his gut, so that every time he laughed he could remember what it felt like to be young again. There's a VCR tape in the living room drawer. Fast forward to the scene where a man who would have looked like me if I hadn't have run away from my father walks out next to a woman radiant enough to be the sunshine when I first opened my eyes. This is my parents' wedding video. In this shot, my father's best friend tells him that he can no longer be a rebel now that he's a married man. This is how I discover that my father used to be a rebel. When I meet his friends from college, they tell me that he used to spend most of his time hanging out with a man named Karl Marx, and a dream of a decolonized India. They tell me I look just like him. And when I say, no, I'm not a man, I mean I'm not that man, my father laughs at me in this video. The same way he will laugh 15 years later in a parking lot. The same way he laughs when I'm back home and use words like revolution and now, and he tells me that he believes in incremental change. So of course I accuse him of being a middle-class liberal who's come to care more about his private property than he has his people, and he tells me that there's this thing that happens when you grow older, when you begin to recognize that you are no longer invincible, which is, I think, my father's way of finally admitting that he was never invincible, that his hands were so sweaty from being afraid of all of the ways I began to look just like him that he could never quite hold on to me, which is, I think, my father's way of finally admitting there are things I had to give up in order to have you. I gained the confidence to yell on the streets because I learned early on how to fight my father. I've been shouting at him for the past 8 years and calling it a relationship instead of a riot, because maybe that's my way of admitting that I see myself in the flames, and maybe that makes all the difference.
Woo! I have goosebumps right now. So, like, this took a lot of time. What was the story behind the whole conception of this spoken word piece?
I've always struggled to talk to my dad. My mom and I have a much more emotionally honest relationship, whereas my father has a lot of boundaries and barriers and walls. And is that a trend you see only with Indian dads, like, because they're so reserved and they don't want emotions and feelings? No, geez. I think it's all dads, but I think in particular Indian dads. which just makes me so sad because when I see Indian dads be emotional and tender, I'm like, why can't this happen all the time? Why does it only happen at a wedding? Come on.
Yeah, it's a very rare side of them. It's like a dark side of the moon you get to see sometimes.
Right, exactly. So I think that my relationship with my father has been stunted and that we just don't really have new memories to create together. And so I think a lot of what my poetry is about is trying to imagine why that is. And I think what's been really beautiful about that poem in particular, I wrote it about 2 years ago, is that I shared it with my father and it prompted a lot of conversations about the questions that I raised.
Which is amazing because most of us wouldn't, like I wouldn't tell my dad the jokes I make about him on stage.
Right. I'm really trying to do this thing where I involve my parents and my family in my art, which can be good and bad. But it was wonderful because I began to learn a lot more about him. And now I like him a lot more.
That's beautiful. So before we end this, I would like to ask both of you all to send a small message to the listeners. What would you like to say?
I'd like to say that you're going to be a future ancestor. And no, that doesn't mean like a literal ancestor with children, but a future ancestor to a people and a legacy. And this is a really peculiar but really important moment that we're in right now. And since I do work with young people in New York City, I think a question that I oftentimes pose to them is if they could travel in the past, what would they do, right? And many of them are actually scared about traveling in the past, butterfly effect, that if they change something in the past, it will have unimaginable consequences for the future, right? And so then I pose to them, then why don't you think that a small action right now would also have a tremendous impact on the future? I think that's what I would want the listeners to know.
To be the change that they want to be.
Yeah, to mobilize right now, it's necessary more than ever.
It's amazing.
I would say it's okay not to come out. And I'd say that to all the time, to especially trans youth, because coming out often means torture for us. It means being beaten up. It means losing our families. And I would say you are valid in your identity and in your experiences, even if you're not able to be out right now. And that actually those of us who are able to be out because we have money, because we have property, because we have English, it's our job to fight for you. And I think that often the most vulnerable members in society get ashamed for not being able to come out. But I'm like, actually, no. Like, we don't have homeless shelters for LGBT youth. We don't have schools that will teach and educate LGBT youth to be safe. Until we build all of that, we can't expect everyone to come out. So what I say is, it's on me. I'm trying my best. But you can do whatever you need to do to be safe.
That's admirable. We fight the fight for the whole team,
right?
And eventually we'll get there. We'll hopefully find a safe haven where we just have to exist and nobody has to ask anything. I think that's. I really hope that we find that kind of place in India and abroad and all over the world. But until then, let's continue fighting, shall we? So thanks a lot again, guys.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
This has been an episode of Keeping It Queer, and you guys are awesome. Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, if you enjoyed the show, you can listen to more of it on any of the podcasting apps you like. You can look out for us on Audioboom, Pocket Cast, Stitcher, Beyond Pod. But if you're looking for us on the iTunes India store, you might have a bit of a trouble finding us because of the language used on the show. So be sure to change your location and then listen to us. For now, it's me, Navin Narona, signing off. Goodbye, thank you so much, and please continue keeping it queer. Hey man, just help me out, man. I need some podcast, man. I haven't had a fix in a week. Just need some.
Don't you worry about it. I got podcast galore for you, man. Just go to ivmpodcast.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram.
Thanks, man. I'm gonna check it out.